It's great to be here with all of you today. When I came back from Vietnam in 1972 and started my conservation career, one of the first people I met in Washington, D.C. was Joe Penfold. He was the venerated leader of a monthly gathering of conservation leaders, and he inspired me to the 44-year career that I've had since then. In the 80s and 90s, I worked a lot with Jack Lorenz and Maitland Sharp, former leaders, people in Scott's position, and they were wonderful people that I learned a lot from and worked a lot with. And so I hold the League in a very special place in my career trajectory as well as in my heart, because you do wonderful things that I care deeply about. I hesitate to say that I'm from Washington and here to help, but a lot of reports get written in Washington. A lot of reports go on shelves and gather dust. But one that didn't was one that Joe Penfold played the pivotal role in. In the latter part of the Eisenhower administration and into the Kennedy administration was something called the Aldo Recreation Resources Review Commission. And they wrote a report to Congress in 1962. And Joe was called by the chairman of that commission, Lawrence Rockefeller, the father of ORC. Not talking about the hobbits or anything, but Aldo Recreation Resources Review Commission, in my opinion, was the single most influential report written in the 20th century. It directly recommended that Congress enact laws, and they did, including the Wilderness Act, the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, the National Trail System Act, and what I want to talk most about today, the Land and Water Conservation Fund Act, and many other site-specific conservation initiatives. As a little perspective, there's 2.3 billion acres in the United States of America of all ownerships and types. Roughly 28% of that is maintained by the federal government, principally by 4 land management agencies, but also including military bases and other public facilities. But principally the 4 land managing agencies that include the National Park Service with 84 million acres, the National Wildlife Refuge System with 89 million acres, the Bureau of Land Management Public Lands with 247 million acres, and the National Forest System with 193 million acres. We got started pretty early as a nation in conservation. Abraham Lincoln set aside Yosemite Valley in 1864. Ulysses S. Grant signed the law establishing the first national park in the world, Yellowstone, in 1872. And as everybody in this room knows, Teddy Roosevelt set aside millions and millions of acres as national forests, as wildlife refuges, and national monuments during his term in office. That said, there's a lot of work to be done. And when Congress enacted the Land and Water Conservation Fund Act of 1965, they set in motion a mechanism for federal and state governments and local governments, to a great extent, to enact new conservation measures. Most of you know that most of the federal lands are in the West, including Alaska, the so-called 11 western states. And on average across those states, 47% of the land in those states is federal. For the rest of the country, the average is 4%. And Congress deemed that some more land should be purchased. But in order to fund that purchase, Congress said, we will tap several sources of money, but principally when we lease outer continental shelf oil and gas to private companies and deplete that resource, because it's finite, that's owned by all of us, we're going to set aside a portion of those monies, those royalty payments that go into the Treasury, into a special account, which is called the Land and Water Conservation Fund, in the Treasury. That account is then to be used for the purposes of the 65 Act. And that amount started out at $100 million a year. Several years later, it grew to $300 million a year, and in 1978, Congress increased that fund to $900 million a year. And it has had many, many accomplishments. Let me just say a word about how it works. There's two accounts. There's the federal account and the state account. Federal account funds land acquisition by the 4 public land agencies that I mentioned. Most of that acquisition occurs in the East, and most of that acquisition occurs on places that Congress has already designated and drawn a boundary for and said those agencies are authorized to acquire that land. The Congress, each of these agencies, I'll separate out the Fish and Wildlife Service. They have quite a separate law for wildlife refuges, but for the Park Service, no unit of the system is established without an act of Congress or a presidential proclamation, and the proclamations can only apply to existing federal land. So Congress authorizes land acquisition by the Park Service, the Forest Service, and the Fish and Wildlife Service. Forest Service and Bureau of Land Management acquisitions are mostly limited to what I would refer to as special management areas that Congress has designated. National recreation areas in the forest system, national conservation areas in the BLM lands, and for segments of wild and scenic rivers or national trails or wilderness areas where there were private lands interspersed. So the Act is intended to complete or add to the conservation estate of America. And so, my clicker here. The other side, beyond the 4 federal agencies, the federal side of the fund, are the state grants. Those are 50-50 matching grants. States develop what's called the SCORP, the Statewide Comprehensive Outdoor Recreation Plan, that defines how they want to spend their share of the money. The grants are provided through a formula written into the statute that determines how much each state gets. It's largely based on state population. Every state gets a share off the top, and then the rest is distributed by population. The 5 territories qualify for a small amount as well, and Indian tribes get a small grant. So over the course of time, the 50 years that the Land and Water Fund has been in existence, Congress has appropriated $10.2 billion of those OCS receipts spread over 50 years and acquired 5 million acres of those for those 4 federal agencies. They've appropriated 4.2 billion acres for projects in the states. And the states can spend their money on either land acquisition or recreation facilities. And that's the state's choice. And over time, they've acquired 3 million acres and built 29,000 recreation facilities. We did a statistical study over the 50 years. Virtually every county in America has had at least one Land and Water Conservation Fund project funded with this Outer Continental Shelf oil and gas leasing account. And just some photographs of great places. In Guadalupe Mountains National Park in Texas, the National Park Service has acquired 79,000 acres. In the Everglades National Park, 156,000 acres. New River Gorge in West Virginia, a place that is near and dear to my heart because I helped write the legislation that established that in 1978. They have acquired 51,000 acres. On the Ozark National Scenic Riverways in Missouri, 51,000 acres. Pictured Rocks National Lakeshore in Michigan, 22,000 acres. Sleeping Bear Dunes National Lakeshore, also in Michigan, 48,000 acres. The St. Croix National Scenic Riverway on the border between Minnesota and Wisconsin, 23,000 acres. The Great Dismal Swamp, that's not a very good picture. The Great Dismal Swamp National Wildlife Refuge on the Virginia-North Carolina border, 46,000 acres. Okefenokee Wildlife Refuge, 23,000 acres. The Silvio Conte National Wildlife Refuge in New Hampshire, 15,000 acres. Alligator River National Wildlife Refuge in North Carolina, 28,000 acres. And the Headwaters Forest, a national conservation area managed by BLM in California, 7,500 acres. That was hugely expensive because it was virgin old growth Douglas fir and redwood. So much has been accomplished over the years of this fund. And the fund, the name of the fund has gained a lot of political cachet to the point that over time, in previous administrations, Congress has added functions to the program that are funded now out of OCS receipts that I will say strayed beyond the original purpose of outdoor recreation and conservation. For example, the Historic Preservation Fund, a wonderful program, $150 million a year is paid for out of OCS receipts. That $150 million is actually on top of the $900 million that's authorized for LWCF. So that's a good thing. However, in recent years, they've added the Cooperative Endangered Species Grant Program. Endangered species are important, don't get that wrong, but instead of finding new money or taking additional OCS money for that function, it comes out of the $900 million authorization. The same with the Forest Legacy Program managed by the U.S. Forest Service. There's a bunch of money, $40, $50 million a year, that Congress is appropriating for Forest Legacy out of the Land and Water Conservation Fund. So they've been unwilling to tap the additional OCS receipts, of which there are many billions annually that go into the Treasury, and just taking it away from the 900. So what it's done is reduce the amount of money going to the state grants program precipitously and reduce the amount of money that's going to traditional conservation activities of Fish and Wildlife Service, Forest Service, BLM, and Park Service for the original primarily outdoor recreation functions of LWCF. So it's been a gradual sort of bleeding away of the funding of the Land and Water Conservation Fund programs. Some things have been done, of course, over time that have been hugely important. Nevertheless, the states have identified through their SCORP planning process $27 billion worth of projects that they have identified that could have been funded in the traditional way with these OCS receipts through the Land and Water Fund had it been appropriated. Now let me say a word about the politics of LWCF, because it gets a little complicated and sometimes a little ridiculous. There is, first of all, the Land and Water Fund is not a true trust fund in the budget. Unlike the Highway Trust Fund, which is funded by motor fuel taxes, the Land and Water Fund is a budget account. It has to be appropriated each year by the appropriations process out of the fund. If it isn't appropriated in 2 years after it was deposited, $900 million is deposited each year from OCS receipts. If it isn't appropriated out for the functions that Congress designates, it reverts to the general fund of the Treasury. There have been efforts afoot for a number of years to turn LWCF into a true trust fund, what in technical terms is called a permanent appropriation. That is, it's an appropriation that happens every year automatically without the vagaries of politics interfering. That effort has so far failed. There have been efforts to increase the amount to go above the $900 million authorized level to accommodate these other programs that are now being funded out of LWCF. Those so far have failed. Most of this opposition, well, let me say importantly, the Land and Water Conservation Fund Act of 1965 will sunset. That law will expire on September 30th of this year. So we are 100 and 20 days or so away from the law sunsetting. What actually sunsets and what the strenuous opposition to extending that date ignores is what sunsets is the state grant program. Because the 4 federal land agencies that acquire land with LWCF still have authority to acquire land. Congress, in enacting parks and refuges and BLM conservation areas, has given them specific authority for that specific place. So that doesn't go away. But it's only the grant program that was authorized by the 65 Act that goes to states that expires on September 30th. At this point, there's talk in the House and Senate about a new bill, but no action. So they're not going to pass law by September 30th of this year to extend that act, except possibly on the FY16 appropriation bill, they could add a simple one line that would change the date. They could change it to, instead of 2015, they could make it 2020 or 2030 or 2050, depending on how aggressive they want to be. My prediction is that if the authorizing committees have not moved a bill in the next month, which I think they will not, that the appropriation committees will then extend the date for a year or two to give the whole Congress time to work more substantively on the law. And there's lots of people with lots of ideas about how that basic law should be changed that are still wrestling. Most of the opposition to extending the date or keeping the fund comes from the public land states in the West, who say, there's too much federal land in my state already, why should I want the agencies to be able to acquire more? There's a big push to require more of the money, maybe most of the money, to be spent on what is called backlog maintenance. All 4 of the federal public land agencies have large backlogs of identified maintenance projects on roads and buildings and trails and other facilities that have been identified and prioritized but not funded because Congress has not funded maintenance. So some are saying, well, LWCF should fund backlog maintenance, not land acquisition. Why reach out for more before you take care of what you have? There are some saying that, well, OCS receipts coming out of the ocean should only go to the coastal states, not the interior of the country. And so there's a clique about that. There's another bunch that say LWCF money should go for payments in lieu of taxes. There's a law in the book known as PILT that pays, when land is acquired and taken off of the tax rolls, pays the counties where that land is because they're not getting tax money anymore, payments in lieu of taxes. That should be funded as a true trust fund out of LWCF. Some of those actually have strong supporters in the Congress. What some of that fails to recognize is that I would say 95% of the acquisitions that do occur are not in the Western public land states. They're in the eastern states, where, as I said before, only 4% of the land is public. Also, most backlog maintenance, 98% of backlog maintenance, are in public land sites that are more than 50 years old. Because they've got worn out facilities, not new areas. So adding a new area does not add to the backlog, because most of the new areas don't have facilities yet. And when they build facilities, they're built out of construction accounts, not maintenance accounts, and they have new facilities, so they don't need as much maintenance. And at least half of the identified backlog of maintenance is roads and bridges, basic infrastructure. Those federal roads and bridges are paid for out of the Highway Trust Fund, not out of general appropriations. But the Highway Trust Fund is deficient because the gas tax hasn't changed in 25 years. So there's not enough money to pay for the roads and bridges across the country. And much of, at least half of this backlog is that roads and bridges and should be paid for out of the Highway Trust Fund. So, what happens now is anybody's guess. My educated guess from 44 years in Washington and lobbying to Congress is we'll pass September 30th. Before the end of the year, they'll do a little couple-year extension. Next year, we'll go hot and heavy, the second session of this Congress leading up to the presidential election. They may or may not get the votes together to pass a comprehensive reform. And then it might get kicked off into the next administration. It is really hard to say. There are a number of organizations, some of which I've been closely affiliated with, like National Recreation and Park Association, the National Association of State Park Directors, the National Association of State Outdoor Recreation Liaison Officers, that want the fund to be more evenly distributed between federal and state. Part of the law now says that not less than 40% of the amount appropriated goes to the federal side. That not less than language has led Congress to appropriate as much as 80% to the federal side. So there's no clear requirement on how much should go to the state grant program. Even if you don't make it a permanent trust fund, they're going to appropriate some amount. And so the state level organizations are advocating for a better distribution. There's another organization, and many around the country, but one in particular called the City Parks Alliance that's focused on urban parks, that is advocating for an even broader distribution, something like 30-30-30. 30 to federal, 30 to state, 30 to city. And there's a big Mayors for Parks campaign underway that's got 60 or 70 big city mayors around the country on it that are advocating for that change. Some other members of Congress are asking for the Safe Rural Schools program, which traditionally was funded with Forest Service timber receipts cost sharing, and that went away when the amount of timber being harvested off the national forest declined. Congress enacted Safe Rural Schools that puts direct federal appropriations to supporting rural schools. Some members from the West in particular are saying that the Safe Rural Schools program should be added to the Land and Water Fund. So there's this huge maelstrom of ideas and political support rolling around the Congress right now, trying to figure out how to save and how to restructure this fundamental law. And there's really no good idea. One solution for the Western state members who say we shouldn't be buying more federal land, that actually has precedent and some reasonableness to its idea, is that new federal acquisition in the 11 Western states should only be funded with the proceeds from the sale of surplus federal lands in those states. One place where that was proven successful was what was called the Southern Nevada Public Land Management Act, which authorized sale of surplus BLM lands in Clark County around Las Vegas and directed the proceeds to acquire shoreline around Lake Tahoe, both of which, Lake Tahoe is a Forest Service managed area, but obviously a wildly popular recreation area and beautiful, where there was a lot of private land on the lakeshore. So surplus land sales in and around Las Vegas have funded many millions of dollars worth of land acquisition around Lake Tahoe. And so in those very tightly controlled and targeted places, that idea, I think, works very well. How long have I been yammering? So I guess I'm leaving you as puzzled as I am as to what the future may be for the Land and Water Fund. I think it's safe to say that there is an enormous coalition of our colleagues in the conservation community that are working very, very hard to see the Land and Water Fund reauthorized, minimally to extend the sunset date, optimally to make it a permanent appropriation, ideally to rebalance it in some way that provides more equitable distribution. Much of the valuable conservation work that has gone on in this half century, this 50 years, has been at the state level. One idea that I've put forward that I haven't seen much response to on the Hill yet is that the SCORP process, the statewide comprehensive outdoor recreation planning process, should require the feds to participate in it. And that with the states in the lead, the states decide what should be done in their state, what the recreation and conservation priorities are, and then together decide who's going to do it, whether it's a city, whether it's a county, whether it's another municipality, or whether the feds do it. It might be that the feds are the last choice, but they'd still be an option. And make the SCORP planning process more important than it has become. Because there's been so little money going to the state side, it's sort of fallen off in terms of significance. But I think there's a real opportunity to reinvent it in a way that lets the states get more control, and that will reduce the opposition, I think, to a federal takeover. I would be most happy to answer questions from any of you on any aspect of this or what's going on in Washington and conservation generally, although Scott can tell you most of those answers as well. I have enjoyed being with you. I've enjoyed talking about this subject, which is near and dear to my heart. And I look forward to success, if not by September 30th, at least in the next couple of years.